On Porlock Harbour in Somerset, early in 1940, builders assembled what appeared to be an old weathered fishing tackle store. The remarkable thing about this structure wasn't its construction, it was that the rust on its corrugated tin roof was applied the very day it was built. A few miles down the coast at Minehead, behind the golf club stood what looked like a rough timber farm building. Near Axminster, a Romani caravan sat peacefully in a field, complete with a straw horse and a scarecrow family arranged around it. In the New Forest, an 18th century dairy house at Beaulieu continued its quiet existence beside a bridge. At Cresswell in Northumberland, a ruined cottage perched on Hemscott Hill, its stone walls crumbling and chimney collapsed. None of these were what they appeared to be. Each was a concrete pillbox, a reinforced bunker with walls up to 3 feet 6 inches thick, housing a Vickers heavy machine gun or Bren light machine gun with interlocking fields of fire. These weren't hidden positions, they were disguised ambush points designed to be seen, accepted, and fatally ignored. The strategic logic was perverse. Whilst military orthodoxy demanded that defensive positions be concealed through camouflage netting and natural cover, these pillboxes relied on the opposite principle. They were meant to look so ordinary, so obviously civilian, that enemy forces would walk straight past them, close enough for defenders to achieve what gunners called point-blank enfilade. This wasn't a desperate improvisation, it was calculated deception, and it emerged from a radical rethinking of defensive warfare by artists, surrealists, and engineers who understood something fundamental. In the chaos of invasion, what appears harmless is more invisible than what is merely hidden. Standard military thinking in 1940 emphasized concealment above all else. Roland Penrose, a surrealist artist commissioned as a captain in the Royal Engineers, wrote in his Home Guard Manual of Camouflage, October 1941. To an old soldier, the idea of hiding from your enemy and the use of deception may possibly be repulsive. He may feel that it is not brave and not cricket. This attitude persisted despite clear evidence from France and Belgium that traditional defensive positions, sandbags, visible trenches, obvious concrete structures, were being systematically identified and neutralized by German forces using aerial reconnaissance and coordinated artillery. The British Army's standard approach to the 28,000 pillboxes constructed between June 1940 and February 1942 was to merge them with the landscape. Specifications called for camouflage netting stretched over frames, turf placed on roofs, and pillboxes dug into hillsides until their embrasures, the firing slits, were barely above ground level. In Somerset, along the Taunton stop line, 6 pillboxes were even coated with a mixture of cow manure and mud, topped with straw, creating what builders hoped would be natural concealment. This was sensible, proven doctrine. German forces had demonstrated terrifying efficiency at spotting and destroying static positions. A 25mm anti-tank gun could penetrate 2 feet of reinforced concrete, as General Brooks' March 1940 penetration trials had confirmed. On paper, the best pillbox was an invisible pillbox. Critics argued that disguising pillboxes as buildings was worse than useless. It would draw enemy attention to civilian structures, making every barn and cottage a potential target. It violated the principle that military installations should be distinct from non-military structures. And once the disguise was penetrated, the moment the pillbox opened fire, it would become an obvious target for retaliatory fire. Better, they insisted, to rely on proven camouflage techniques, matching background colours, breaking up outlines, using shadows and natural cover. What worked for artillery positions and troop concentrations should work for pillboxes. The secret was in understanding what invading forces actually process during combat. Whilst aerial reconnaissance could identify hidden pillboxes from soil disturbance patterns, shadow angles, and vegetation disruption, ground forces moving through contested territory operate under fundamentally different constraints. A German infantry section advancing through a Somerset village doesn't have time to methodically inspect every structure. They're watching for muzzle flashes, scanning roof lines for snipers, coordinating with flanking units, moving between cover. In that environment, a structure that matches their mental category of civilian building becomes functionally invisible, not because it's hidden, but because their threat assessment filters it out. The Beaulieu Dairy House demonstrates this principle perfectly. Built in the 1700s as an actual dairy for making butter and storing milk, it was converted into a pillbox in 1940. The walls were thickened to between 2 and 3 feet, wooden window frames were installed to hide the loopholes, and the original door frame was preserved whilst brick reinforcement was added behind it. From the road and bridge it overlooked, it appeared exactly as it had for centuries, a round, pointy-roofed vernacular building in a landscape where such buildings were common. The loopholes were positioned behind the window openings, invisible from more than a few feet away. A German unit moving along the Palace Road into Beaulieu would see what their experience told them to see: an agricultural building, possibly abandoned, certainly not a threat requiring immediate suppression. This wasn't limited to rural structures. In Bridgewater, a 3-story pillbox stood proud on a bridge embankment, impossible to merge with anything. So camouflage officers roofed it, added painted canvas windows and relied on surprise. In towns and cities, pillboxes were built to look like parts of adjacent buildings, carefully matched in materials and style. At Brighton, one was constructed into the side of a seafront sweet shop. Another in Trafalgar Square was disguised as a tourist information booth. The Type 24 shell-proof pillbox at Cresswell was constructed as a ruined cottage, complete with collapsed chimney and stone walls matching local building traditions, so convincing that local residents have driven past it hundreds of times without recognizing what it actually is. What made disguised pillboxes effective wasn't any single design feature, but rather the psychological principle they exploited. Penrose's manual articulated this clearly. Whereas the discipline of concealment must never be relaxed, disguise should only be used to achieve specific results on particular occasions. In the case of pillboxes, it should be used only on occasions when the result aimed at is beyond the scope of concealment by merging. The tactical scenarios where disguise outperformed traditional camouflage were specific: exposed positions covering key crossing points, locations in built-up areas where natural cover was absent, and situations where the pillbox needed to hold fire until enemy forces were at close range. Consider the tactical geometry. A traditionally camouflaged pillbox covering a bridge must remain undetected whilst enemy forces approach from distance, then reveal itself when firing. That first burst identifies its position. Enemy forces immediately take cover and begin suppression fire. A disguised pillbox covering the same bridge can allow enemy forces to advance across, seemingly unopposed, until they are at the optimal range for the Vickers machine gun. Between 50 and 200 yards, where its 450 to 600 rounds per minute could achieve devastating effect against troops in the open. The disguise doesn't need to survive scrutiny. It only needs to prevent the enemy from identifying the pillbox as a threat during their initial approach and assault across the objective. The Home Guard, which manned these positions from 1940 to 1944, understood this viscerally. These were often men who'd fought in the Great War. They knew what being fired upon from an unexpected position did to advancing troops. The manual stated, "A man who is well concealed can bide his time, watch for the enemy to expose himself and hold his fire until his target is sufficiently close to make sure of it." That patience, waiting whilst enemy forces moved past, around, or through what they believed was civilian infrastructure, required nerves and discipline, but it transformed a static defensive position into an ambush. The construction techniques for disguised pillboxes were remarkably sophisticated. The Beaulieu Dairy House required builders to thicken existing walls without disturbing the external appearance, position reinforced concrete to support a roof that appeared unchanged, and create firing positions that aligned with window openings whilst maintaining structural integrity. The Cresswell ruined cottage required stonemasons to deliberately create weathered-looking stonework, to leave gaps suggesting collapse whilst actually supporting a concrete core, and to position the collapsed chimney to provide additional cover for the entrance. Documentation from the Home Guard manual specified exactly how to construct these deceptions. For a pillbox disguised as a haystack, metal cowling was fitted above embrasures to keep hay out of firing ports, whilst maintaining the exterior appearance. Hooks were installed for removable disguise elements. For barn-style disguises, builders constructed false roofs at angles different from the actual structure, attempting to suggest the building faced a different direction, though Penrose's notes admitted puzzlement at quite what this was supposed to do once the pillbox had opened fire. The construction rate was frenetic. By the end of September 1940, just 4 months after the evacuation from Dunkirk, 18,000 pillboxes had been completed. The Directorate of Fortifications and Works, FW3, established in May 1940 under Major General G.B.O. Taylor, issued 6 basic designs, types 22 to 27, for rifle and light machine gun positions, plus designs for 2-pounder anti-tank gun emplacements, type 28. But these were templates, not rigid specifications. Local commanders adapted designs to circumstances and available materials. Brick was used as shuttering, essentially forming a mould for poured concrete, then left in place. Beach sand and pebbles were mixed into concrete at coastal sites. Scrap metal, including bed frames and park railings, was incorporated as reinforcement. This expedient use of local materials aided camouflage, but it also meant builders could match local architectural vernacular when creating disguised positions. The disguised pillbox program emerged from an unlikely collaboration between military engineers and avant-garde artists. Roland Penrose wasn't merely writing manuals, he was lecturing at the Eastern Command Camouflage School in Norwich and at the Camouflage Development and Training Centre at Farnham Castle. Stanley William Hayter, Julian Trevelyan, and other artists employed by the War Office studied how perception worked under combat conditions. They understood something professional soldiers often didn't, that camouflage wasn't about matching colours or textures, but about exploiting how the human brain categorises threats. Penrose's lectures were unconventional. He would insert a colour photograph of his partner Lee Miller lying naked on a lawn, covered only by camouflage netting. When challenged, he argued, if camouflage can hide Lee's charms, it can hide anything. This wasn't mere provocation, it demonstrated that the brain's pattern recognition systems could be deceived by disrupting expected forms, even when the underlying structure remained visible. The same principle applied to pillboxes. A concrete bunker becomes invisible when the brain categorizes it as barn, or cottage, or fishing shed. The manual provided accurate guidance on texture as well as color, crucial for protection from aerial photography, which was monochrome. But the truly revolutionary insight was about ground-level perception during combat. Penrose wrote, "It is useless in warfare to be merely brave if bravery means presenting oneself as a useless target to the enemy. It is far better to employ intelligence and concealment, so as to induce him to present a target." This inverted traditional military thinking. The goal wasn't to avoid being seen, it was to control how you were seen, to manipulate the enemy's threat assessment to turn their own perception against them. German military doctrine in 1940 was supremely confident and in many ways justified. The Wehrmacht had torn through Poland in 28 days, conquered Norway, overwhelmed France, supposedly the world's finest army, in 6 weeks. Their tactical doctrine emphasized speed, concentration of force, and rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. Reconnaissance was thorough, artillery was devastatingly effective. German forces expected British defensive positions to follow predictable patterns: trenches, sandbags, obvious concrete structures positioned at militarily logical points. What they weren't prepared for was systematic deception, operating at the level of cognitive psychology. A German infantry officer advancing through Somerset wouldn't expect to encounter military installations disguised as civilian structures, because that violated the conventions of warfare as he understood them. British and French positions in 1940 had been, in the German view, conventionally positioned and conventionally destroyed. The assumption that British home defences would follow similar patterns was reasonable and potentially fatal. The disguised pillbox worked because it exploited the difference between what's militarily logical and what's psychologically effective. Militarily, a pillbox covering a bridge should be positioned for optimal fields of fire protected by earthworks, camouflaged with netting. Psychologically, that position announces itself. There must be a defensive position here. Where is it? The dairy house that's been beside this bridge for 150 years announces nothing except ordinariness. The German unit knows British forces will defend the bridge. They're scanning for firing positions, checking obvious cover, advancing with appropriate caution. The dairy house isn't on their threat matrix. This approach had limitations, deliberately acknowledged. Penrose's manual stated that disguise should only be used when the result aimed at is beyond the scope of concealment by merging. Once a disguised pillbox opened fire, it became an obvious target. The disguise offered no protection against return fire, unlike a well-dug-in position. But that first burst, delivered at close range against troops who hadn't taken cover because they didn't perceive a threat, could be devastating. And in the defensive scenario Britain faced in 1940 to 1941, that might be sufficient. The goal wasn't to hold indefinitely. It was to delay, disrupt, inflict casualties, buy time for mobile reserves to respond. The disguised pillbox represented a fundamental shift in defensive thinking. Traditional fortifications, from medieval castles to Maginot Line positions, sought to create impregnable positions that could withstand assault. The British pillbox network, especially disguised positions, wasn't designed for endurance, it was designed for ambush. General Ironside's plan, submitted to the War Cabinet on 25 June 1940, stated, "This system of stops and strong points will prevent the enemy from running riot and tearing the guts out of the country, as had happened in France and Belgium." The defensive concept was based on accepting that German forces would establish beachheads, that airborne assaults would penetrate inland, that armoured columns would achieve local breakthroughs. The pillbox network, approximately 18,000 structures by October 1940, wasn't meant to stop this. It was meant to channel it, slow it, fragment it, prevent the kind of devastating exploitation that had destroyed Allied forces in France. Disguised pillboxes played a specific role. They were positioned at natural choke points, bridges, crossroads, defiles, where German forces, believing they'd advance past British defensive positions, would be ambushed at close range. This tactical philosophy required accepting casualties, accepting that many pillboxes would be destroyed once they revealed themselves, accepting that deception was more valuable than durability. It was psychologically difficult for regular soldiers and especially challenging for Home Guard volunteers. The 1.5 million men enrolled in local defence. The manual addressed this directly. But that matters very little to our enemies, who are ruthlessly exploiting every means of deception at the present time to gain spectacular victories. They can only be stopped by new methods, however revolutionary these may appear to those who believe only in ancient traditions. Of the approximately 28,000 hardened field defences constructed, about 6,500 survive today, roughly 25%. Many disguised pillboxes remain precisely because their disguises were so effective. The Beaulieu Dairy House is a listed building, protected because it's an 18th century structure, not because of its military history, a protection its disguise inadvertently provided. The Cresswell pillbox received listed building status only on the 15th of September 2020, the 81st anniversary of a decisive Battle of Britain victory, despite being in plain sight for 80 years. The survival of these structures provides physical evidence of the programme's sophistication. The metal cowling above embrasures on Type 24 pillboxes disguised as haystacks, the careful matching of stonework on the Cresswell ruined cottage, where masons created weathered-looking gaps whilst maintaining structural integrity. The Beaulieu dairy houses preserved wooden window frames, positioned to hide loopholes that remain invisible except at close range. These weren't crude expedients, they were carefully engineered deceptions. Documentation from the period confirms the scope of the program. Artists Roland Penrose, Stanley William Hayter, and Julian Trevelyan were employed specifically to conceal defences. Instructions specified that in built-up areas, pillboxes should be disguised to look like part of an adjacent building, carefully matched, and provided with a roof to look as if they had always been there. Examples recorded include haystacks, derelict cottages, seaside kiosks, bus stop shelters, railway signal boxes. Near Axminster, the square pillbox disguised as a Romani caravan with scarecrow family and straw horse maintained throughout summer months. At Watchet railway station, a small but elegant beach cottage resplendent with veranda. Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely in September 1940 and formally cancelled in 1942. The RAF's victory in the Battle of Britain denied the Luftwaffe the air superiority necessary for invasion. The Royal Navy's strength made a contested channel crossing catastrophically risky. But German planners, studying British defences through aerial reconnaissance, also saw something troubling. A landscape transformed into a prepared battlefield, with defensive positions at every natural choke point, stop lines following rivers and ridges, coastal crusts of overlapping defensive zones. What they couldn't see, couldn't photograph, couldn't assess were the disguised positions. How many barns contained concrete bunkers? Which cottages were actually firing positions? Was that ruined structure on the hillside actually derelict, or did it house a vicar's gun with a clear field of fire over the valley? This uncertainty compounded the known difficulties of amphibious assault. German forces would be landing on heavily defended beaches, advancing into a countryside where every village might be a fortified node, every bridge a killing zone, every apparently civilian structure potentially a military installation. The psychological impact of systematic deception, of never knowing which structures were genuine and which were ambush points, was impossible to quantify, but strategically significant. German tactical doctrine relied on rapid movement, on infantry advancing with confidence behind armoured spearheads, on the momentum of breakthrough. A landscape where any structure might suddenly reveal itself as a defensive position, imposed caution, slowed advance, disrupted tempo. Combined with the known difficulties of crossing the channel and the RAF's continued resistance, it made invasion increasingly unattractive. The disguised pillbox wasn't accidental military genius. It was the product of deliberately unconventional thinking applied to desperate circumstances. Britain in 1940 lacked the tanks for mobile defence, lacked the aircraft for air superiority, lacked the time for elaborate fortifications. What it had were concrete, local labour, natural choke points, and artists who understood perception. The result was a defensive system that inverted orthodox military thinking. Rather than trying to be invisible, critical positions were made to look civilian, ordinary, beneath notice. The principle extends beyond World War II pillboxes. In any conflict where defenders face overwhelming attacking forces, deception becomes more valuable than strength, ambush more effective than fortification, psychological operations more decisive than firepower. The German forces expected British defences to be predictable, and predictable defences can be systematically defeated. Unpredictable defences, positions that exploit the attacker's own perceptual categories and assumptions, create a fundamentally different tactical problem. Penrose's manual concluded, "Camouflage is no mystery and no joke. It is a matter of life and death, of victory or defeat." The disguised pillboxes of 1940 to 1941 proved that understanding how enemies perceive the battlefield is as important as understanding how to fortify it. A Romani caravan in a sunset field, a dairy house beside a Hampshire bridge, a ruined cottage on a Northumberland hill. These weren't desperate improvisations. They were calculated applications of psychological warfare to defensive engineering. They worked not despite seeming civilian, but because of it. And the fact that 80 years later, people still drive past them without recognition suggests the disguises achieved exactly what their designers intended. They made military installations invisible by making them appear ordinary. The most dangerous positions, it turned out, were the ones nobody thought to fear.